Okay, guys. Uh, Today we're going to finish off, hopefully, with Indigenous peoples. And so, what we'll be looking at today is more or less the history of Indigenous peoples in terms of their forced relocations. All Indigenous peoples everywhere in the world have their lands stolen from them. And when these lands are stolen, states need to put Indigenous peoples somewhere else. And as I said before many times, states want Indigenous peoples' lands, but they don't want Indigenous peoples. And so what this leads to is that after they steal their land, they have to find out where they're going to put them, right? Because they can't kill all of them anymore, like the Spanish did with the Taino, for example. So this leads to what are called forced relocations. Now, some of these forced relocations can occur inside of the country, especially if the country is a big country like China or the United States or Australia, right? And so that's what we're going to look at first today. We're going to be looking at some of the more famous and massive relocations of indigenous peoples within one country. But then last time, as we left off, we were just leaving off, I was saying that indigenous peoples, both contemporarily and historically, have been the targets of state genocides. And when people are targeted with genocide, uh, there's a tendency to try to escape being killed and exterminated by the state that's trying to exterminate you. And so, in many cases, indigenous peoples are forced not just to leave their land, but to leave the country that's essentially trying to kill them. And so this is where we see indigenous peoples becoming what we call diaspora populations, involuntary diaspora populations, where they not only have to leave their land, but they have to leave the country that their land is situated in or located in. And so we'll be looking at involuntary indigenous diasporas after we look at some of the more famous uh, historical relocations of indigenous peoples. And let me just say that this isn't in past history. Indigenous peoples are still constantly being forced off of their land, probably most commonly because of, as I've mentioned in here before, hydroelectric projects that build these huge mega dams, like the Three Gorges Dam here in China. Those things are going up all over the world. As we saw last time in the map I showed you on South America, uh, China is helping build some of these dams around the world. Um, and there are lots of dams going up right now, for example, in Cambodia and Laos along the Mekong River, which are displacing tremendously uh, long-standing indigenous populations as well, right? And even here in China, uh, this is something that continues up to the present day, all over the world: China, Canada, Australia, the United States, New Zealand, South Africa. That's what we're going to look at today. So we don't have to reach back into history, actually. As you can see from this slide here, we have an example of indigenous peoples who are currently being forcibly relocated off of their land. With the Tibetans here in China in Xinhai province, for example. If you take a look at the date, May 27th, 2019, that was less than a year ago, but the Chinese government is essentially trying to destroy the Tibetan nomads' traditional way of life. I mean, they've been nomads or nomadic peoples for essentially thousands of years. And now the government of China, in the name of progress and modernization, is forcing them to stop their nomadic lifestyles and forcing them off of their historical lands, their ancestral lands, as it says here in the title, and forcing them into small apartments in, in, in urban areas in major cities. And this as well could be considered to be a form of cultural genocide. as well, because as I said before, if you take an indigenous people off of their land, that's the first start. I mean, that's the first step to the complete eradication and destruction of their culture. And you cannot have nomads and nomadic people continuing to practice their culture in a small apartment in Xin, uh, Xinjiang, for example, right? But this is what's been going on as of late. Here's another report of Tibetan nomads forced off their lands from 2017. So this is something that's systematic and something that's ongoing right now here in China. All right. So just to let you know, this is not something from the past. Okay. One of the most massive relocations of indigenous peoples in history took place not that long ago, less than 40 years ago, during the 1980s in South Africa, where the South African government basically decided that it was going to steal almost all of the indigenous people's lands in Africa. And then, actually, I've talked about this before, they copied the American system. They copied the American system. The American system, like we're going to see in Australia, has a reservation system where they basically forced indigenous peoples to go to these small pieces of land and then stay there under threat of death. They were essentially outdoor prisons. And this is what South Africa was doing with its indigenous peoples, tens of millions of peoples during the 1980s, to a great amount of international criticism, by the way. Yes, but this isn't ancient history. This is not that long ago. Okay. Some of you have researched the Inuit as your indigenous peoples, and I've talked quite a bit about the Inuit, but the Inuit actually, people think of Canada as one of these cool countries that starts with the C, but actually Canada has a very ugly record in terms of human rights when it comes to its indigenous peoples up until just recently, as we saw with the kidnapping of young indigenous children and forcing them to go to school/prisons, yes, and the forced assimilation and cultural genocide. During the Cold War, Canada, if you can look at this map up here, you see where the arrows are. That's a region of the Arctic that is so cold that people really can't live there. But Canada wanted to claim it to make sure that it was going to be Canadian territory. So basically, it went to the Inuits down in Nunavut. You can see the bottom point right here. And it basically said, well, we're going to force you to go live much farther north. We want you to live up there. And the Inuits were going, we can't live up there. It's too cold. There's not enough food to hunt. We'll die of freezing and starvation. But Canada forced them to do that anyway. And guess what? A number of them died from freezing and starvation. And so this was the forced relocation of an indigenous people because of Cold War politics right here. But even Canada is doing these really ugly, terrible things. Probably the worst of all in terms of 20th century, at least, forced relocation of indigenous peoples was this guy down here. It's considered to be history's greatest mass murderer as well, Joseph Stalin. And Stalin, from the period of prior to 1939, actually he started this in 1937, of forcing indigenous peoples and other minorities off of their land and moving them literally halfway across the country, moving them thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers away from their original homeland. And probably the best example I can give you of that are the indigenous Lithuanians in the far western part of China. You'll see up here in the very, very top of this map, you have what are called the Baltic countries of Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. And this is where, especially at the beginnings of World War II, Joseph Stalin basically tried to take most of the indigenous peoples from that area and move them all the way across the country, as you can see from the arrows, into Siberia, where there were very few people living there. And they did that normally in cattle cars, as you can see from the photographs here of people being put into these uh, cattle cars that would be across what was called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And then these people were taken off to the eastern part of Russia, dumped in the middle of Siberia, where many of them, uh, just like the Inuit, froze and starved themselves to death by the tens of thousands, right? So you can see more detail in this map right here of the populations that were being moved. You can see in the southern part of uh, Russia, the Chechens. Remember the people who've gone through 5 genocides. Well, genocide number 4 was this mass relocation of all Chechens from their homeland to Central Asia, and again in Siberia. And in this movement of peoples from Chechnya to Siberia, around 50% of the population died as a consequence of dying in transit from lack of food and exposure to the elements, dying from weather conditions once they arrived in the middle of winter with no housing and no supplies, and then dying of starvation as well. So this is where we can see the indigenous group that was separated from their territory in terms of the greatest distance, though, were the Lithuanians and the Stalin. And as you can see, when they arrived to Siberia, very, very cold conditions. And you can see, in this case, a young Lithuanian child that had either starved or froze to death. Yeah. Okay, and so these were very traumatic experiences. As I said, it's always a very traumatic experience when an indigenous people is forced off their land and lose their land. Because as I said before, land means everything to indigenous peoples. There's nothing more important than their land, right? Let's just take a look. Out of the Lithuanian population of about a 500,000 people, about 1 in 3 were taken from their land. 70% of the victims were women or children. 1 in 3 were affected by the relocation, causing tremendous psychological harm. After Stalin died, all of these peoples, the Chechens, the Lithuanians, were allowed to go back to their homelands in 1957 under an official government policy. But by that time, it was simply too late. For the Latvians, about half of them had either didn't ever return again or who died during that period of time. And again, from exposure, from freezing, from lack of food, these sorts of things as well. Okay, and here's another forced relocation from what are called the Kalmyks. They're the only Buddhist population that's found in Europe. Actually, originally, they're Mongolian, so we can't consider them to be really indigenous, but they came in with the Mongolian invasions of the 12th and 13th century into Russia, and they stayed. But you can see that Stalin decided that he was going to move them again, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from the land that they've been living on for 600 to 700 years, and put them in the middle of Central Asia. Okay, and then, as I said before, the Chechens. The Chechens are the indigenous peoples that are probably the most famous in the Soviet Union and today in Russia, because they're the indigenous peoples who've been the most victimized, but also the indigenous peoples to be the most resistant to Russian imperialism and repression. And as a consequence of that, they've paid the price with 5 separate genocides. The most recent one ending in 2001 under Vladimir Putin. Okay, we also have a tremendous land loss and relocation on the part of Australia. Australia essentially copied the American system as well, setting up what it called reserves for Indigenous peoples, in many cases reserves that were far away from their traditional homelands. You can see a map of some of these reserves and Indigenous areas here on this map as well. This took place primarily from 1900 to 1905. Not too far away, right next door in New Zealand, you have the mass forced relocation of the Maori peoples off of their traditional homelands into these very small, again, copying from the American system, what could best be called reservations. They're not called reservations in New Zealand, but the concept and the effect is the same. And then we get to the country that more or less started it all in terms of giving other states like Australia and New Zealand and Canada a model to follow in terms of what do you do with Indigenous peoples once you've stolen their land and you want to move them somewhere else. And so most people aren't aware, but there's a state in the United States called Oklahoma. And at one time, the United States government decided that they were going to move all of the Indigenous peoples from the eastern part of the United States, those peoples that had survived, to this region called Oklahoma. And that was where they were going to put all of their Indigenous peoples from the eastern part of the United States. And so this is where you can see a number of Indigenous peoples going all the way down into Florida with the Seminoles, who were forced from their lands and forced to go thousands and thousands of miles, kilometers. And again, many of them dying, just like the Chechens and the Lithuanians in the process. These forced relocations are no cakewalk. And as a matter of fact, in many cases, they made them walk these thousands of kilometers when they forced them off of their lands. And many of them died in the process. In fact, the United States has a historical trail now. It's called the Trail of Tears, that these Indigenous peoples had to walk when they were forced off of their lands in places like Florida, and then forced to walk to this new piece of land called Oklahoma, right? Okay, so here you can see a larger map showing the displacements and relocations that were occurring under official United States government policy. And you have to understand, the Seminoles who live in Florida, they live in a tropical environment. They live in a tropical environment. I mean, they know how to hunt crocodiles and alligators and things like this. And then the American government picked them up and put them in the middle of a desert. The equivalent of a desert. I mean, they had no idea how to survive in a place like Oklahoma. It was a completely foreign ecosystem to them. And this is what happens oftentimes when you forcibly relocate Indigenous peoples. You're taking them off of land that they know and they know how to survive on, and putting them in a completely foreign environment and saying basically, okay, start again. And they have no knowledge of the land, where to find water, what plants to eat, what animals to hunt, how to hunt those animals. And so they're completely disoriented in terms of, to the land that they've been forced to go to. Okay, so those are some of the more famous forced population movements inside of countries. And you can see a clear pattern there where they set up these outdoor prisons. The names change. In the United States, they're called the reservations. In Australia, they're called the reserves. In South Africa, they were called the Bantustans, but in all cases, it's the same concept. Steal an indigenous people's land, move them long distances away from their traditional lands where they've been living for thousands of years, give them the most marginal land that you can find, the poorest land, the worst land, land that nobody wants, put them there, and then turn it into an outdoor prison where they're threatened with death if they try to return to their traditional homes and homeland. Okay, now we come to involuntary diasporas. Here again, we come back to China. Here again, we come back to the Tibetans. In 1959, the Chinese army occupied and invaded what was remaining of an autonomous Tibet. And at that period of time, the Dalai Lama, the religious and political leader of the Tibetan people, decided that he was going to leave China, or what he thought temporarily, and set up a foreign government in another country, in India. And so he and many of his followers crossed the Himalayas into India, into a town called Dharamsala, and that's where they've been living essentially since 1959, so over 60 years. So this is where we can see them making this crossing, and this is where they become an involuntary diaspora. They didn't want to leave their homeland, but they were fearing for their culture and their way of life, and in some cases their lives. And so they established the Tibetan government in exile in India. And this is where you can see where they have their base today in Dharamsala. There's the Dalai Lama. There's the homepage for the Tibetan government in exile. You can see in the upper left. And then you can see that there are indigenous peoples living in China, but there are about 500,000 or so Tibetans now living outside of China, primarily in India. And here we go again with the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has just retired. Now he's been replaced with a new leader of the government in exile. I can't remember his name, but he's here shaking the hand of the Dalai Lama on the left. And there you see their offices that they have set up in India. And then some of the Tibetans there carrying passports from the government of the Tibetan government in exile. Okay, so let's just go with that word because I know it's a word that most of you haven't heard of before. But a diaspora is a Greek word meaning dispersion, meaning to disperse means to scatter, right? And it refers to members of ethnic groups who have voluntarily left their homeland in large numbers, or who have involuntarily been forced out of their homelands, like the Tibetans, for example. And so, and this is where they take up and start living in other countries. All right. So sometimes these voluntary and involuntary diasporas are called economic versus political diasporas. So most voluntary diasporas are what we call economic diasporas. And most involuntary diasporas are what we call political diasporas. The voluntary diasporas leave for economic reasons primarily, and I'll give you a lot of examples of that in just a second. The involuntary diasporas leave primarily for political reasons, because of genocide, because of intentional starvation, because of being targeted for repression and violence, because of suppression of native religions, all kinds of different reasons. But these are all what we consider to be political reasons, okay? All right, so an example. Now, you guys, or most of you, who are the Chinese in this class, are probably the world's most famous example of what we call voluntary diasporas, because China and Chinese people have diasporas literally all over the world. And in one of my favorite Chinatowns is in Sydney, in Australia. Another one of my favorite Chinatowns is in San Francisco, in in California, in the United States. Now, both of those Chinatowns were actually created with the discovery of gold and what's called the gold rushes that occurred in California in 1848 and in Australia in the 1860s, right? When gold was discovered, many Chinese from China said, "Hey, there's gold in Jungguo. Yes, let's go get that gold." So they left voluntarily, hoping that they could get rich working in the gold fields of California. And the same thing happened when gold was discovered in Australia. Lots of Chinese left China to work in the gold fields of Australia. And as a consequence, they started Chinatowns in San Francisco and in Sydney as well, right? But this is where we can see Chinatowns now all over the United States, but most of them were created, again, for economic reasons by people voluntarily leaving China and looking for better economic opportunities in other countries. Now, the biggest uh, diaspora and the biggest Chinatown in all of the world is where I actually live in Bangkok, where there are nearly 4 million uh, Chinese Thais who live in the city of Bangkok and surrounding areas. About 1 in 3 people living in Bangkok is actually Chinese Thai. But again, they came to Thailand for voluntary economic reasons, chiefly, primarily. Yes. Okay, so this is where just getting this idea of now the Chinese diaspora is probably the most famous voluntary diaspora all over the world. But it is a diaspora. But there are what we call involuntary diasporas as well. People who didn't want to leave their homeland, but were forced to leave. And probably the biggest involuntary diaspora in the world today are the Afro Americans that are found in countries like Brazil and Cuba and uh, Venezuela, and the United States, who were forced to cross the Atlantic by Europeans to become slave labor in the Americas. And so this is the world's biggest involuntary diaspora that exists in the world today. The oldest involuntary diaspora uh, originates with another indigenous group called the Jews, who originate from what today is Palestine and Israel, and what used to be called, when they were the indigenous people living there, Judea under the Roman Empire. And it's during the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, the Romans essentially said to the Jews, you have to leave Judea or we will kill you, all of you. And the Romans meant it. I mean, the Romans were killing Jews. And so, as a consequence of this, this diaspora was created involuntarily, again, for political reasons, 2,000 years ago. And you can see on the map here that they dispersed or scattered all over the Middle East and Northern Africa and all the way into uh, Eastern and Northern Europe, right? And so this is an example of one of the world's most famous involuntary diasporas. All right, well, I was hoping to get done today, but when we come back next time, we're going to finish off with this. We're going to be looking at some of the more famous involuntary diasporas, including the most recent involuntary diaspora that we've seen just created in the last few months with the Rohingya Muslims who've been forced out of Myanmar or Burma and are now living in massive refugee camps by the hundreds of thousands in neighboring Bangladesh. Okay, so we'll take a look at them and their plight, and then some other indigenous diasporas that were created around the world and what they're up to today. Okay, all right, so we'll see you. Stop share. Adiós, muchachos.